Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Godels and Pat Cummings. Compared to Europe and other industrialized countries, the United States has an unusually violent labor history. In the 1920s, the once lively union movement was almost snuffed out by brutal business and government oppression. But in the 1930s, following the Great Depression, labor movements fought back. They secured many gains for workers, still enjoyed today, such as the 40-hour work week, overtime pay, medical and retirement benefits. Key to these successes was the leadership provided by the U.S. Communist Party. Although small in number, they were generally the most committed, militant, and fearless activists and organizers. Who were these Communist Party members? How did they assert such control over our labor history? Where did they go? Let's discuss. Well, hello, Greg.
Glad to be back.
And I see you brought a guest with you, Dr. Keeran, who is the go-to person on issues with labor history, and specifically, we want to be talking about some of the things in his book, The Communist Party and the Auto Workers Union. So, welcome. Can I call you Roger? Is that okay?
Oh, of course.
You know, Roger, I've tracked you on the internet, and you are quite the sole source, if you will, for the history of the labor movement and how the communists have influenced this movement so profoundly in our country. And although Greg knows this through his background, I knew nothing of this. And so this has been a real exciting time for me to learn about this. And I think today I'd like you to maybe take us through some of the labor history and bring us up to date. And it's certainly what happened in the early turn of the century and after the Great Depression is still applicable to what's going on today. How does that sound?
That sounds good. I want to thank you and Greg for this invitation to discuss the book, which has just been republished after being out of print for several decades. Unlike other kind of book talks, I'm not interested in promoting the book because I have any financial reward from this, but because I think the ideas are as valuable now as when I wrote it. And I would, if you don't mind, I'll begin by saying two ideas that kind of resided behind the writing of this book. The first idea, comes from Marx himself, who said, we have one science, which is the study of history. When he said we, he mean we who are socialists who are trying to transform this capitalist society, we have one science, which is the study of history. I think that remains true today. If you want to make historical change, you have to view history as a science, as a laboratory, and study what went before, what succeeded, what didn't succeed. So that's, in a way, that's kind of motivated this study 40 years ago. And the second thing, I think, as to why this particular study, the auto workers and communists, remains relevant and important, I would start with two facts. That is, if you look at the labor movement 100 years ago and look at it today, look at the labor movement in the 1920s, 11% of the workers were organized.
Uh-huh.
You look at the labor movement today, about 11% are organized. But in between that was not a steady figure. In the 1930s, that figure jumped, and nearly 30% of the workers in the country were organized. By the 1953, over a third were organized. The same thing, another snapshot, if you look at the history in terms of strikes. In the 1930s, every year there were 800, 900, up to 2,000 strikes a year. Do you know how many strikes there were last year of over
Mm,
1,000 workers? Less than 10.
oh my
In
gosh.
fact, in fact, in the last 10 years, there's been only 1 year where there was over 10 strikes. So there's been a precipitous decline in the percentage of workers organized since the 1930s, and a precipitous decline in class struggles and strikes. Now, what I would suggest is that to understand such a phenomenon, of course, many things go into it, but one of the most important factors that determined these two facts was the Communist Party and then the decline of the Communist Party and its influence in the labor movement. And I think the auto workers is a prime case study of this.
And it's like the little engine that could. It was a small group of people, but they were the most powerful in organizing and motivating and anyway, it struck me how much of our labor history was shaped by these group of people that we really don't know we don't know much about.
Well,
And
I would add that it's not because it's a buried history. It's not because it's been overlooked. It's been consciously uh, put aside. It's been consciously thwarted. It's been consciously kept from people, particularly in the labor movement. It effectively it's a history purged. And that's why I think Roger's book is so exciting, was and is so exciting. It's so exciting to see it available again.
so Roger, let's just start and hit a couple of points here. In 1919, are you in Pittsburgh right now, or are you in New York?
Jersey City.
Jersey City. Okay. In 1919, there was the Great Steel Strike in Pittsburgh. And maybe you or Greg could talk about what were the conditions like for a steel worker at that time in Pittsburgh, and then tell us a little bit about the history of this strike and how it kind of primed the pump, if you will, for future activity, if that's correct term.
I'll let Greg comment on that, but let me just, if you permit me, put that steel struggle of 1919 and kind of the larger struggle and kind of relate it to the auto workers. So in 1919, 1920, again, what you have was 11% of the workers of the country in unions. But the vast majority of workers who were not in unions were increasingly part of mass industrial industries like steel, like auto, like rubber, like chemical, like electrical production, but they weren't organized. Those 11% that were organized were mainly skilled workers, craft workers, carpenters, plumbers, iron molders, etc., mainly in the construction industry, and they belonged to craft unions in the AFL. Now, what's really remarkable is that not only were the masses of workers not organized, not only were the mass of workers unskilled and semi-skilled workers like those in steel and those in auto, but the leaders of the AFL, who in the early 1920s was Samuel Gompers, and later in the 1920s and early 30s was William Green, did not even believe in organizing these industrial workers. They believed that they were really unorganizable because they didn't have any skills. So there was no attempt made really to organize these industrial workers outside of a few in garment and the mine workers. So one of the key lessons, you might say, or a striking phenomenon of the 1919 steel strike was that a few people around William Z. Foster decided to try to organize these steel workers. And even though that strike went on for 4 or 5 months and it was eventually defeated, what it showed is that these workers, who, by the way, consisted of about 24, 25, or 26 different nationalities, could be organized, could conduct a concerted struggle for months. And even though that struggle eventually lost, it showed that the idea of organizing these mass industrial workers and leading them in class struggles and strikes could work. I think that's the significance of that 1919 strike. Maybe Greg would like to add something to that.
Well, just repeat the comments you made earlier, Roger, that it was a laboratory. I mean, using that terminology, it became a laboratory for what came later, and it showed many people that again, they were ethnic people. You know, there's lessons here about immigration because so many of these people were Italian, Polish, Eastern European, Southern European immigrants who came here, spoke little, were gathered up in their own ghettos. The Catholic Church was the centerpiece of that. So they were difficult to organize, but they also brought a lot of class consciousness with them from Europe. And so that added another dimension into this organization. But it was a laboratory for Foster and the people around Foster to learn how to go forward. If I'm not mistaken, Foster was kind of a syndicalist before this. His thinking emerged from that syndicalism. He learned from that and he developed it further. One of the factors that go into the 30s and union organization is the ability to learn from these experiences.
And back then, you'd have a person die a day in the steel mills, and they just would grab another one off the line. And because it was an exploitation, just like Greg and your family history in the coal mines in central part of the country, these people were exploited horribly. Often working 7 days a week, no ability to really have any one of their problems at work presented to the employer, and it was just a brutality that was quite remarkable. And so in 1919, they had enough then, and organized this strike. And what you're saying, Roger, is that it gave people the realization that you can organize people other than these higher, more technical labor. You can organize, and that was the lesson, part of the lesson from that strike.
Right.
You know,
but, go ahead. Just say, just to draw the connection between this 1919 steel strike and communist and auto in the 1930s, is that, I mean, a key element in this was Foster himself, who was a leader of the steel strike, who was a fantastic organizer and a fantastic speaker, and who could establish this trust with the workers, and who was even able to work with the AFL at that point and to get at least their nominal support for this struggle. But what happens in 1919 is Foster joins the Communist Party. Now, the Communist Party had just been formed in 1919. It was formed by left wing of the Socialist Party, as well as by members of the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. And they split with the Socialist Party and decided to form a Communist Party for a couple of reasons. One, they were motivated by this idea of what a communist is, as Karl Marx defined, that a communist was a person who believed that the history of the world was the history of class struggle, and that communists had to support the workers in this class struggle. And they were motivated by Lenin's idea in 1902 that he wrote in What Is to Be Done, that what was needed was what he called a party of a new type. A new type, he meant a socialist party that would not just be an electoral party, would not just be an educational organization, would not be a discussion group, but no, a party of activists. That was the key idea, a party of activists, a party of people who would organize, teach, lead people in struggle, and who would belong to an organization that was centralized and disciplined. And so that's what the Communist Party represented in 1919, how it differed from the Socialist Party. So this young Communist Party, representing a few tens of thousands of workers who had been socialist or IWW, but they attracted to it the leading industrial unionist of his time, William Z. Foster. And Foster then established an organization within the Communist Party called the Trade Union Educational League, and later the Trade Union Unity League. And through a series of pamphlets and books, he wrote about the 1919 steel strike and the lessons of that strike and what it meant for successful organizing of industrial workers. And these ideas were embodied in the TUEL and in Foster's writings, and he kind of educated a whole generation of young activists in the trade union who then became active in auto and rubber and steel and other places. Okay.
So I wrestled in high school and was a fairly good wrestler, and my hero was Dan Gable. And Dan Gable he was from Iowa. He went through all of his high school and never lost a match. He went through all of his college, and the very last match that he wrestled in, he lost at the end of his college career. And he then went on to become the greatest wrestler of all time. Got a gold medal, and I'm not so sure that not one person even scored on him when he went to the Olympics. And he said, the best thing that happened to me was losing that match, because it gave me a focus. It let me realize what was, it motivated me. And I see a little bit about, if you just looked at 1919, they lost. The strike was broken. No one was organized. They didn't get any of their demands. And yet that singular event seemed to have lit the fire that really created our labor movement. Am I being too, am I exaggerating there, or do you think that's a correct statement?
Yeah, I think that's more or less correct. Yes, I think so. And I think we're at you might say, another little moment like that in history right now, with the Amazon workers and Bessemer, Alabama, trying to organize. Now they voted, the votes being counted right now, 6,000 or 7,000 workers, 85% of them African-American. This will be, Amazon represents what, the largest or the second largest employer in the country, just as US Steel and General Motors represented the largest employers of their time. So if these workers decide to go with the union, this is going to be a very promising moment for American labor. It's going to show that these kind of post-industrial workers, delivery people and warehouse workers can be organized in an industrial union. But the point is, even if they don't win this time, it's going to be close. And I think whether they win or not, there are going to be lessons drawn, and the union movement is not going to go away. It's shown the potential of organizing these Amazon workers. So win, lose, or draw, there are lessons going to be drawn, just like the 1919 strike, and this struggle will continue.
So Foster was a prolific writer. He used this period of time to gather strength and organize. How is a communist different in America, in U.S., from the communists that were shaping the Soviet Union at that time? And how are they connected? They both had Marx as their foundation, but was there, compare and contrast?
Well, I think the most striking thing, certainly one of the most striking things about the environment in which communists worked in this country in the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s, is that communists never enjoyed what you could call full citizenship in the labor movement or in the country, really. That is to say, and this was unlike in England, unlike in France, unlike in Italy, unlike even in Spain before fascism. That is to say, communists in the United States in the 1920s, the 1930s, and 1940s could not operate as open communists in the labor movement, because many unions had constitutions that wouldn't allow officers to be communists, or wouldn't even allow members to be communists. So it meant having to function in this conspiratorial, semi-secret way, But in spite of this, the communists were incredibly effective, as you pointed out. But this was a major difference, though, that American communists faced. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that the anti-communism in this country, the environment in which communists had to operate, was stronger in this country than in any other capitalist country outside of fascism, outside of Germany or Italy or Spain, or maybe Tsarist Russia, that is the kind of circumstances in which these American communists had to operate, which gives them even more credit that they were able to succeed as well as they did in this extremely hostile environment. Now, in terms of the relations with the Soviet communists, what I would say is this. In the 1920s and 1930s, we're talking about less than 2 decades after the Russian Revolution, that the Russian Revolution, the Soviet Communist Party, and Stalin himself had immense prestige in this country amongst not only communists, but other leftists as well. This was the first country, the first movement, the first party that had overthrown capitalism. And not only that, they were very rapidly taking this peasant, illiterate, backward country and moving it into the first ranks of industrialized and agricultural and even military powers in the world. And secondly, in spite of their own internal problems, they were the only ones giving support in the struggle against fascism in the 1930s, then occurring in Spain. So in other words, you just can't overestimate the kind of prestige and influence that Stalin and the Soviet Communist Party had on the American communists as a source of inspiration, really. I think the closest thing would be, if you could remember the kind of influence and prestige that Che Guevara and Fidel Castro had in this country in the 1960s and 1970s. Right. I think that one kind of ironic, you might say, indication of this prestige was the life of Walter Reuther himself. Walter Reuther, who later became president of the UAW and threw the communists out of the UAW, the leading anti-communist labor leader in the country after World War II. But in the 1930s, he was a socialist. And in the midst of the Depression, he and his brother Roy went to the Soviet Union looking for work and ended up working in the Gorky Ford plant there. Well, it gives you some idea of the kind of prestige that Soviet communists had for American leftists in the 1930s.
And was the communication mechanism primarily their writings and their pamphlets and with the foundation of the Marxist philosophy?
Look, I mean, let's be frank. Communists in the 30s and 20s had a communist international. They had an international that linked various communist parties. There were joint meetings, there was collaboration, there was mutual discussion, planning, an attempt to create a singular line, a singular position to push the goals forward. It makes all the sense in the world. I mean, in the West, you have NATO doing that as in opposition to communism. And that was there. And of course, that was the basis for charges of Moscow puppetry and Moscow pulling the strings and all this other nonsense. But essentially, there were these links and of collaboration, and they make all the sense in the world to anyone that has a common goal.
Right.
But of course, it's portrayed certainly in the 50s, in the 60s, and even today as somehow a puppetry, as though Moscow pulled the strings and the U.S. Communist Party had to fall in line. Not only Roger, but others have pointed out in terms of when the U.S. Communist Party began to move towards more of a popular front notion or united front, came at a time when the Communist International was not directed in that fashion. So there was each country had its own unique conditions that it had to deal with, and that was respected by the Communist International.
Yeah, but it's interesting you said that we think of the red baiting and the extremely well organized denigration that occurred during the 50s, but that was occurring also prior to that they had to have keep their head low in a way. So.
Sure.
So get us up to the Depression. So the Depression happened, the Great Depression, and Roosevelt, and that seemed to spark an awful lot of conflict within the labor unions. In the summer of '34, there were huge strikes all over the South, leading up to the issue of the Great Sit Down, Great Sit Down strike that you wrote so extensively about in your book. Set the background of how the Depression and the events in the Depression acted as a catalyst for that next explosion of organizing that occurred.
Okay. Well, I think the best way to understand the explosion of the 1930s and the role of the communists in that explosion is, again, to kind of step back and compare the conditions of 1931 and the conditions of 1941. And that kind of creates the problematic for us. So again, you look at American labor and the country in 1931. The Depression had started in 1929, so we're 2 years into this Depression. Again, the only 11% or so of the workers are organized. Nearly a third of the workforce is out of work or working part-time. And all of those large industries, auto, steel, rubber, electric production, et cetera, are mass production workers unorganized. And in the midst of this depression now, with nearly 1/3 of the workers out of work or working part-time, there's no unemployment insurance, there's no retirement, there's no minimum wage, there's no right to organize. You do not have a right to organize. An employer can fire you for claiming that you want a union. There's no legal protection at all. And as I said before, the AFL, led by William Green, opposed attempts to organize industrial workers. They opposed strikes. They thought that progress had to come through cooperating with the employers, worker management cooperation. The AFL opposed unemployment insurance. They thought this was a dole that would weaken the character of unions, et cetera. Okay, that's 1931. Now you jump ahead 10 years, 1941. All of the workers in the major mass production industries are organized. They have unions. Now, General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, US Steel, Republic Steel, International Harvester, General Electric, et cetera, in industrial unions. You have workers have a right to organize now with the National Labor Relations Act. The law kind of is on their side. They have a minimum wage. They have pensions through the Social Security Act. Well, how did this come about? How did this change come about? Now, it's like any large social change. There are many factors that go into it. But one thing we can clearly say, it did not come about spontaneously.
Right.
It did not come about because the employers, the capitalists, suddenly realized, unions are a great idea. We're going to recognize these unions. No, did not come about because employers thought, it's great that workers shouldn't starve. We'll give them unemployment insurance. It didn't come about because the AFL leaders like Green suddenly had a revelation either, because they thought, yeah, let's go out and organize those industrial workers. Foster showed that we could do it. Let's do it. No, that did not. They didn't suddenly change their mind and decide that that unemployment insurance is not a dole. No, we need it. No. It came about because of grassroots struggle. And what do I mean by that? I mean petitions, demonstrations, protests, organizing, strikes. And these mass demonstrations and mass organizing at the bottom, more often than not, was led by communists. Because in 1931, you look at the entire country, who was advocating the organization of industrial workers? Only communists. Who was advocating the workers in order to gain had to strike, had to be able to withhold their labor power? Only communists were taking that position. Who was advocating that workers needed unemployment insurance? They said unemployment insurance even controlled by the workers themselves and paid through by taxes. Only the communists were taking this position. Who was calling for minimum wage, et cetera, et cetera. So the communists had the stage to themselves in terms of these ideas, and they organized around these ideas. For example, in the AFL, the communists contacted about 20,000 locals of the AFL and asking them to support a petition supporting unemployment insurance. This came from the rank and file, from the grassroots, and eventually Green and the AFL leadership changed their mind on this. The same with industrial unions. Workers led by communists started organizing industrial unions and auto and steel and other places, and then started demanding their own unions. And eventually, some of the leaders of the AFL, like John L. Lewis, the head of the mine workers, changed their mind on this. But again, this
is like this is a 10-year period
exactly
that literally set the foundation for things that we take for granted so much today. Just
right.
Yeah.
And it did not happen suddenly. It did not happen spontaneously. It again happened through these movements at the base. This grassroots movement led more often than that by communists.
So let's go to the sit down strike in GM, Flint, Michigan in 37 then, as one of these events. And I don't know, Greg or Roger, tell me, normally when I think of a strike, I think of people outside the picket line and people go cross the picket line or don't, but tell me how the sit down was different and how that was that established as a technique that was proved so successful. Tell me about that.
You want to jump in there, Greg, or no?
No, this is where your book is so beautiful. I think you can tell this better than anyone.
Well, you'll see a certain pattern to my answering your questions. I always begin by backing up a little bit. But I think that the operation of the communists in auto was not only a microcosm of how communists were operating in other industries and other unions, but it provided the turning point, if you will, the key event in the whole organization of industrial workers. And so let me jump ahead, then I'll go back. But again, you look at before this sit-down strike, which went on for some 44 days in the General Motors plants, largest industrial corporation in the world, and the workers seized the key plants and Cleveland and Flint, Michigan, and other places, and refused to leave. And eventually, after over a month of this sit-down strike, General Motors agreed to recognize the union and negotiate a contract. Now, before this sit-down strike, no major industry, no major corporation, no major capitalist had agreed to recognize their union and mass production industry. After this victory and General Motors, industry after industry capitulated, starting with U.S. Steel, who had fought Foster in 1919. And essentially the Myron Taylor, the head of U.S. Steel, said, if General Motors, the largest corporation in the world, couldn't resist this union, well, we're not going to resist it either. And he said, plus, if this strike movement continues, it might turn into a revolution. Right. So anyway, this was the straw that broke the camel's back. This unleashed the dam of industrial unionism, this victory in General Motors. Now let's back up. How did you even get to that point of that General Motors sit-down strike? Again, it took 15 years at least of organizing in the auto industry to bring this about by the communists. They started there because the AFL refused to organize industrial workers. They started their own independent union, the Auto Workers Union. and they put out their own newspapers. Again, kind of propagating this idea that workers and bosses have different ideas, different interests. Workers need their own unions, and all workers have the same interests: black, white, immigrant, native born, men, women. We're all in this together. Again, these were revolutionary ideas,
Radical ideas, yeah.
radical ideas. But so for a decade and a half, the communists promoted these ideas, and they led some major. That, of course, their effort to organize the unions were badly disrupted by the Depression, or
Right.
most workers found themselves on the street. But that did not stop the communists from organizing. They turned their organizing into organizing the unemployed, and they led major demonstrations demanding relief, demanding unemployment insurance, putting workers' furniture back in their homes when they were evicted, marching on the Ford plant in March 1930, demanding worker wages, etc. And then when employment picked up again, they went back to organizing unions and organizing what were called federal labor unions. These were kind of industrial unions within the AFL, but linking these FLUs together and having them demand industrial unions, which would engage in militant activity against the bosses. So,
And the communist, was it Foster that came up with the sit down model where you basically just shut the machines down and refuse to leave and take over factories?
well, I tried to trace back where this idea came from and how, and I wasn't too successful on it. It's like a lot of things. I think that the ideas were in the air. I think one of the first examples of this idea being in the air was French workers. But actually, the IWW, even in this country, had engaged in brief sit-down strikes before World War I in some plants.
Okay,
But,
so
but the most recent ones were in the early 30s in France. And there, I think it showed kind of the advantage that communists had. Those sit-down strikes in France were led by communists. And so you had communists in this country who were aware of what their comrades were doing abroad. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if that's kind of how that idea was transmitted to Americans here. And of course, what had happened in previous strikes, as when the auto workers had gone on strike in 1933 in Briggs and other places, is that the employers brought in the police, broke up the lines, and hired scabs. There are a lot of unemployed people out there. And so the idea of sitting in this plant and protecting your jobs seemed like a brilliant idea, and a way of preventing the use of police to break up picket lines, arrest strike leaders, and to bring in scabs to make things go. So these ideas were in the air. They were picked up and by communists who then organized this. And when we speak about organizing, you don't run a strike like this for 44 days inside a plant without a tremendous amount of organization.
Right.
You've got to feed people. You've got to keep them entertained. You've got to have discipline. You've got to have outside support. You got to have publicity. You got to have legal help. And all of this was organized by the Communist Party. And it was this level of organization that really made the strike successful.
So let me read something to you. I have something here. This will set the stage. And tell me if this doesn't sound like Bessemer, Alabama. In those days, you got a job and you just stuck with it. You didn't complain to management. You were just this faceless clog, slaving like a robot. And when they speeded up the production line, that's what they did. It was almost impossible for workers to go to the bathroom. They had no sick benefits, no overtime, no unemployment, no retirement. If the production line stopped, you didn't get paid. And when it started up again, you had to work that extra time and you didn't get overtime for it. So anytime a line stopped, people didn't get paid.
Dead time, it was called.
This is prior to this strike that you're talking about. The Pinkerton agents spent thousands of dollars on the Pinkerton agents that would come in and infiltrate the plants and work side by side. And if they suspected someone was being in a union, they would just immediately be fired. No recourse, no, and often really in a brutal way. At that time, the DuPonts, some of these names of these DeVosses, DuPonts, Carnegies seem to kind of come up over and over again. They owned a quarter of all GM stocks. And even the legal system with Judge Black, which was the judge at the time that was making decisions on this, ended up having $200,000 worth of GM shares, which is like $3.7 million today. And he was the one that was making all the legal decisions associated with. So this is the foundation of what was going on. And then in this 10-year period, what all of those things I mentioned were pretty much resolved, right?
Right, right. I think that Judge Black story is a good little sidelight to the role that communists played. So the General Motors went to court and got an injunction that the workers had to leave the plant. The injunction was issued by this Judge Black. So the question, well, what do we do? I mean, the law's against us here, you know, telling us we have to leave the plant. They're going to bring in troops, you know, probably, or police, private guards to enforce this injunction. So the communists called in their legal help, Maurice Sugar, Lee Pressman, and these were left-wing lawyers who saw the law as a tool that could be used to further struggle, not that you had to capitulate to. So I forget whether it was Sugar or Pressman came up with this idea. I said, well, look at this Black is a leading figure in Flint. Maybe he owns General Motors stock. So through their contacts, they investigated, and as you pointed out, sure enough, he owned hundreds of thousands of dollars of General Motors stock. Well, of course, this was compromising. He had a conflict of interest. How could he be ruling on the legality of this strike when he had a material interest in seeing this strike ended? So this exposure virtually invalidated this injunction and allowed the strike to go on. But it was just an indication of how this struggle was engaged on multiple levels.
Tell me about women in this strike. The importance of these mothers and these, and as I read your book, it couldn't have succeeded without them. Do you think? Am I correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. Of course, I mean, again, all of these strikers had to be fed.
They were fed by the communists.
Right.
All of the pamphlets were the communists. All of the organizers were essentially the small core.
They were the leaders anyway, but obviously it couldn't have been done without the mass of workers too. For example, they organized a kitchen to cook meals for the workers. Well, Dorothy Krause was the woman who organized that kitchen. Dorothy Krause was the husband of Henry Krause, who was the communist who put out the paper and had worked with Mortimer in establishing the Federal Union in Cleveland and the key General Motors plant there. And Krause brought in a left-wing chef from one of the leading restaurants in Detroit to cook meals for the strikers. But of course, you had to get the raw materials, you had to get the pots and pans, you had to get the vegetables, you had to do the cooking, you had to do the delivery. All of this required massive work, massive organization. Of course, then there were other problems too, like there were rumors that the men in the plant had women, that there was all kinds of shenanigans going on. This was done to demoralize the wives that were at home. And so you had to have other women had to go out and visit the wives of the strikers and
calm them down.
Calm them down. This is not going on at all. You know, this is a disciplined strike. In fact, you should come and support us by picketing outside the plant. And so they organized this emergency brigade of women to picket outside the plant. And those pickets were often very important in terms of dissuading and discouraging Pinkertons and strikebreakers from crossing the lines.
Yeah.
Yeah, women were key, but again, it wasn't spontaneous. That was all along, whenever the communists organized unions in auto, they organized what were called in those days Williams auxiliaries, to try to get the women involved in these struggles as well. And this, of course, manifested itself in the sit-down strike.
And you can't make this stuff up. They're in the one building and they said, we need to take over a Fisher 2 or another building. And there was so much infiltration and all the Pinkertons and all of that they planted false information that says we're going to take over number 6. And so all the police and everybody went to that building, and it was a ruse. They actually then diverted and took over the number 2, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back when they got that plant.
Right.
And it was, that would not have been successful had the women not come and stopped the troops from coming into that plant. They were the ones that were at the door, and it's like over our dead bodies kind of thing. That I think it's an amazing. It read like it was some crazy Hollywood script to see this and to think this was the actual events that occurred.
You would think that this would be the grist for a Hollywood movie. You would think with all the topics that people search for to make into a movie, someone would stumble over this history and present it fairly and accurately to people as a docudrama or even just a drama. It's so dramatic, and yet it doesn't happen, and that's an issue in itself.
Well,
the other thing I would add is that this UAW organization is one thing. There are a number of other CIO unions that were organizing as well. This was inspirational to all of them, but you could find almost a direct correlation between the left leadership or the communist leadership of the CIO union and the position of that union or local or whatever regarding women in the workplace, women, Blacks, African Americans. The more advanced the leadership was in terms of their politics, communist left wing, the better the policy of the union. The less advanced, the more corrupted it was. What the old socialist organizers would always try to downplay issues of race and sex and things of that kind because they could get in the way of going forward. The communists never compromised that in their leadership roles in the unions.
And then the swelling of the unions became from that point on until we hit World War II. What happened then?
Let me, if I could just back up just for a second,
Okay.
Pat, on the point on that kind of convoluted seizure of plants at the end of the strike. I think what should be pointed out as well is that, when the Cold War set in, the Communist Party was presented as a criminal conspiracy, as secretive, as duplicitous, as deceptive, etc. But look at the way that strike unfolded, though, at Fisher Body 4, Fisher Body 2. That tactic only succeeded because it was conspiratorial, because it was secret, and the communists could do this because they were used to operating this way. It was illegal for them to operate openly. They had to learn how to operate secretly, so to speak. And the same with organizing the union. When Mortimer went to Flint in 1936 to begin organizing, he could not recruit people openly. He could not sign up people openly. He had to meet them secretly in homes lit by candles so nobody else knew who was there. That's how repressive the situation was. So the communists knew how to operate in these repressive situations, and successfully. And then during the 1936 strike, this practice of being able to operate so-called conspiratorially worked in this seizure of Fisher Body Plant number 4, I think it was, right?
I,
So
I,
anyway, it's just, I think, important to point this out. Now let's go back to your question. Then what happened with World War II? And and of course, what happened with World War II was, or after World War II again, was the beginning of the Cold War, and a concerted effort to drive the communists out of the labor movement, indeed drive them out of all aspects of American life. And what I would point out is that, to begin with, is that this anti-communist drive after World War II. Well, first of all, I mean, this wasn't the first time there'd been an anti-communist drive. There was one after the so-called Haymarket Riot of 1886. There was one during and right after World War I, the so-called Red Scare. So this is the third major wave of anti-radicalism, anti-communism. But this wave after World War II involved two things. One, I would say, a half lie and a big lie. Or a half truth and a big lie. So the half truth was that the communists were a threat to American capitalism and American security. Well, this is a half truth, of course. There's some truth to that. I mean, wherever the capitalists have been overthrown in the world, whether in Russia or in China or in Vietnam or in Cuba, communists played a role in that, obviously, the leading role. And in this country, when workers have made advances, as they did in the 1930s, organizing unions, cutting into capitalist profits, again, capitalists were at the forefront. So there is some truth to this idea that communists were a threat, but not the threat that they were portrayed in after World War II, after World War II. If the capitalists had agreed that the communists were a threat because they were simply cutting into profits and organizing workers and giving them better wages and conditions, that would have been pretty damning. So that's not the threat they promulgated. Instead, they wrapped this half truth into a big lie. And the big lie was that the Soviet Union wanted to take over the United States militarily, that this was the big threat. Now, this was preposterous. This was absolutely preposterous after World War II. The Soviet Union lost 27 million people during World War II, 1/3 of its cities, 1/3 of its industries. It was not about to invade anybody or engage in any military conflicts. And if you look closely at the history, you see the Soviet Union was very conciliatory after World War II. But the idea was, the other preposterous thing is that the Communist Party was going to aid the Soviet Union in taking over this country by acting as spies and saboteurs and espionage, and that their particular role in the labor movement was to take control of the labor movement, to use the labor movement to aid the Soviet Union's foreign policy aims. Again, this was a big lie.
but wasn't it convenient?
Yes. I mean, but it's important to point out that not a single American communist, outside of the limited and rather dubious case of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, there's not a single case of an American communist being convicted of espionage or spying or sabotage. It was a big, big, big lie.
It was the original QAnon.
Yeah, there you go.
It was with kids being abused in pizza basements and such.
Right.
Yeah, but it was effective.
Right, but it was very effective, and so starting with the UAW, a coalition came together of the leading capitalists, corporate leaders, the leading Republicans, leading Democrats, the Catholic Church, and the Socialist Party to drive the communists out of the labor movement. And the first place they did this was the UAW. And it was done through propaganda and publicity. It was done through congressional campaigns. It was done through legal action. I mean,
Well,
just to give you,
that
go ahead.
goes me that gets me to this Mohawk Valley formula. I didn't know anything about this. I was listening to an old Chomsky debate, and he said you really need to do some research of what they call the scientific approach based on propaganda for union breaking and strike breaking. And this was after the Remington Rand strike in the late 30s. Here's the plan that they said needs to be implemented. Discrediting union leaders, check. Frightening the public with threats of violence. They're going to take over everything. Using local police and vigilantes to intimidate strikers. Forming associations of, quotes, loyal employees to influence the public debate. That sounds like the Twitter brigade in Amazon, where they're these fake accounts. Fortifying workplaces, employing large numbers of replacement workers, and threatening to close the plant if it doesn't go along with what they want. I mean, tell me this isn't Jeff Bezos writing this memo.
Okay,
Am I right?
All right. Right.
And
That was the blueprint used in the 1930s, and it continues to be used.
there it is right there. That's the the memo we got, right?
Right.
In Rogers' book and in the book Stalin over Wisconsin, the role of the attack on UAW Local 248, the Ellis Chalmers local, is a kind of a keystone. Do you see that, Roger, as one of the critical turns, just as the sit-down strike was a critical turn to build the union movement? Do you see that as a critical turn in destroying it? It was a 340-day strike, which they couldn't break.
Right.
They had to have federal hearings you can't even dream of. Would you agree that's a turning point in?
I think that's a good way to put it. I put it the same way. Just as the General Motors was the turning point in the organization of mass production industries, so the strike at Ellis Chalmers was the turning point in the Cold War. And indeed, it's not just poetic to say that either. The hearings that led to the passage of the Taft-Hartley Law, which was the main anti-communist labor law passed in 1947, they occurred. The main example for passing that law was the investigation of the role of the left in the Ellis Chalmers strike. In other words, the Ellis Chalmers strike provided the evidence for passing the Taft-Hartley Act. Plus, the strike occurred after Reuther had just become president of the UAW. And he used that strike to bash the communists and to really sell out the workers in order to get rid of the left in Local 248. When I was writing my book, I interviewed Harold Christoffel, who was the leader, president of Local 248, a real hero, a man completely forgotten for the most part among the left and labor. But he said, we could fight. And how many days was it again? 248 days?
300. It was almost a year.
He said, we could fight the corporation. He said, we could fight the government, but we couldn't fight all three. We couldn't fight the corporation, the government, and our own union. He said, that's what finally did us in. And then they brought these congressional anti-communist committees into Milwaukee, and they called Christoffel before the committee as well as other officers, and they asked him if he was a communist. He said no, he wasn't. And then they showed that he'd signed petitions for the communists for governor, et cetera, et cetera. So then they took this great heroic union leader who had built this union and sent him to prison for 5 years for so-called perjury. So this was another little, just to reinforce your point of how 248 became the turning point in this anti-communist movement.
And they killed the goose that laid the golden egg. It was these people and their passion and their organization, and then you have the corruption that comes in with our government and McCarthyism and red baiting, and then the union itself turned and used the red baiting it from their perspective to consolidate their power. And really, it's never been the same since. You
Right.
know, then
Yeah,
it
Just
became dysfunctional, and there you go. You know,
little anecdote from my past. Growing up, I went to high school with a guy named Billy Matthews, and years later I ran into him. And where I grew up, there was a major General Motors foundry, which was given to General Motors after the war for probably $1, for built for war production. And it employed everybody. Everybody in my block outside of the coal miners were employed by General Motors foundry. So Billy became, I see him later. I lost touch with him and he says, "Oh man," he says, "I remember you. You're the guy that told me in high school about Paul Robeson." And I said, I didn't know who Paul Robeson was when I was in high school. But anyway, he gave me credit for being this lefty and all this stuff. And he then was the president of that local. And he talked about, I mean, he'd done so much and they were going to shut it down and close it down. But what struck me was we talked, we were kindred spirits all those years. And I really appreciated the respect he had for me because I was a kind of a socialist when I was in high school. But he kept up bringing up Walter Reuther. And there was this heroic picture of Walter Reuther among auto workers. There was a piece of propaganda that just clung. I mean, he said, "Oh, I learned about labor history and all this stuff." To me, it's tragic that a Christoffel went to jail and a Reuther became the iconic labor figure that he became. But I have a question, Roger.
mm-hmm.
Do you connect Rutherism, let's call it Rutherism, and that kind of opportunism from that period to the situation of the auto workers today, the level of corruption? They indicted the former president, Dennis Williams,
Mm-hmm.
last year. The president before him is in trouble. Much of the union leadership is indicted, has pleaded guilty, or taken a plea around corruption. Is this a direct result of that opportunism that occurred in the late 40s and early 50s to kick the communists out?
Yeah, I think it's not only that. I think if you look at the UAW for the past 20 years, what are the main trends you see? First, a complete decline in membership from
Right.
1.7 million to some 400,000, only a third of whom are auto workers. Second, the destruction of or reduction of wages and conditions. After 2008, for example, they put in a two-tier system where new workers made less than half of older workers. In parts companies like Delphi, they reduced the wages by over 50%. And then corruption, as Greg pointed out 2 years ago, the Justice Department filed charges, indicted 12 officers of the UAW, including 2 former presidents, for racketeering, embezzlement of over $1.7 million. I forget what exactly, maybe it was nearly $17 million. So, I mean, I think would this have happened if you had a leadership that believed that the most important thing in the world was class struggle, was fighting
Right.
for the interests of workers? No. What with Walter Reuther you got was the beginning of this idea, again, that workers benefit when the corporations benefit. The corporations benefit when the workers benefit, labor management cooperation. And of course, once you start down this path, then what do you do when the corporation wants to move production to Mexico? What do you want to do when they say in order to survive, we have to cut wages? It's a very short step from this kind of collaboration to collaboration on corruption.
Right.
And so once you move away from this class struggle unionism to class cooperation unionism, it's a very slippery slope from there to corruption. And it's not only in the UAW you can see this in other unions as well.
And you started by the so few strikes, that are occurring.
Right.
And look at what just happened. Was it last week or the week before with the Ford plant? Ford is making EVs, electric vehicles. And the negotiation with the union gave up the tiered pay system. They gave up their medicals. They gave up their wages. They said, all we want is job security,
Right.
of which Ford agreed in their last. So what did they do? They just announced they're moving the production down to Mexico.
Right.
Okay, well, what are you going to do? Send them a, send them a dirty email, yell at them on Twitter,
Right.
how,
I remember,
how about a nice sit down strike?
remember
Back when, back when they opened up the two-tier system, when they established that, the union leadership gave that up. We're going to have 2 tiers now. The starting tier, I did a back of an envelope calculation for an article I was writing, and it turns out the starting tier with that agreement was exactly the pay that Henry Ford was giving, back in his time when he started mass production at Ford. Can you imagine 100 years later, more than 100, well, 100 years later, auto workers who were organized were making no more as a starting wage than they were at the time when Henry Ford, out of the goodness of his heart, paid these workers what he paid. It's shocking. It's shocking. It's despairing.
Right.
Well,
and remember that these struggles of the 1930s succeeded during a time of economic depression. Even in 1933, when the auto workers went on strike, they were able to reverse some wage cuts. And the Great Sit-Down strike was able to succeed, even though there were still thousands and thousands of workers unemployed, and when the employers were crying poverty. So believe me, General Motors was in worse shape in the 1930s than they are today.
right.
And
right.
they're still crying poverty.
Well, Roger, this has just been an absolute pleasure for me. And as I said in the opening, I knew so little of this, and I'm a pretty bright guy, and I know history, and this is just off my radar. Go ahead.
This is the original 1986 version, paperback version of Roger's book, which has been long out of print, but is now available today from international publishers, and I'm sure from other bookstores and other sources, but it's well worth a read. And I think this captured some of the flavor of the book, but there's much, much more in the book. It's just a delight to read, and it's a pioneering effort in correcting the historical record.
And
I
want to make
appreciate it so much.
I want to make another comment about the book. It's, my gosh, you've got 45 pages of footnotes and references and interviews. How long did it take you to put this together? The foundation, you just don't make stuff up. You say, and here's the data and here's the information. It's so pleasant to see a book written like that.
Well, thank you. It took years and years, but again, I knew what I was doing was going against the grain of the existing history that was out there, and I had to prove what I was saying. So I put the work in.
Did you ever get any negative feedback from your elevating, the shedding light on the positive influence of the communists? Did this ever affect you professionally as in your professorship or work environment?
Well, I guess you could say that. I wrote this book while I was at Cornell University in the School of Industrial and Labor Relations. And after the book came out, even though a book was supposed to be enough for tenure, even though I won teaching awards, even though I started a program and union leadership, I was denied tenure, and then for years could not find another academic job. So I don't have concrete proof that it was because of this book, but I suspect that was the main reason.
It was because of the book, I'll say it. Yeah.
You're in good company with Cornell West. The same thing. Well, thank you so much, Roger. And again, I appreciate your time, and this has been wonderful, and I think one of the better ones we've done, Greg. Wouldn't you agree?
I agree. I quite agree. Yeah. Thank you, Roger. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. The thanks is all mine.
All right. Bye.